Good morning to those of you in the West, good afternoon, good evening to those of you further east. We're delighted that you're joining us here today for UNIDIR's discussion on New Start and beyond. I think I'm going to know that the panelists that we have are a big source of interest for many of you, so I'll be speaking very briefly, but I just wanted to introduce why we're having this discussion today. We are in an era of, I think it's fair to say, it's less and less about forging arms control agreements and more about navigating their erosion. Treaties regulating weapons of mass destruction in particular are under threat in today's environment. We've seen the collapse of bilateral arms agreements such as the INF, and we've seen existing WMD treaties struggle to navigate difficulties heavily related to issues around compliance and enforcement. The JCPOA, for example, is one plurilateral model, the Open Skies Treaty, the question of the Chemical Weapons Convention as another. So really, we're seeing profound questions about the authority, the scope, and the effectiveness of rules governing state behavior, not just in the arms control space and the broader multilateral environment too, but very much having an impact on how arms control and specifically in the area of WMD is functioning and working and organizing itself. So in that context, we really are exploring and needing more than ever new ideas and fresh thinking about how we can find perhaps effective ways to both increase the potential for predictable, effective international arrangements that can support stability, security, and possibly cooperation between states. So it's in that context that we're approaching the New Start question today. And really, this is a work that we here at UNIDIR, with the support of Norway, has been exploring over the past year. Specifically, our question has been, how can compliance and enforcement be assured in a complex and unpredictable global system? And what makes WMD arms control agreements work? We've taken a cross-cutting approach and explored lessons that could be drawn from a range of existing WMD treaties in the nuclear, the biological, and the chemical field, looking at bilateral and multilateral treaties. So there you see some of the publications that we've been working through and the questions we've been exploring with a great range of experts from around the world over the past year. Currently, we're looking a little bit more forward, and we're looking at what might be the technologies, the tools, and the approaches that might support and possibly strengthen compliance and enforcement. And how can some of those ideas be fed into existing WMD arms control negotiations and frameworks? Which brings us to the question of the day, the question du jour, as they say here in Geneva, New Start. Currently, the only nuclear arms agreement between Russia and the US, New Start, is set to expire in less than 5 months on the 5th of February 2021. And while the prospects for New Start are not yet clear, at the center of the debates around its renewal, issues of confidence in compliance have been central. And therefore, we were very keen to bring into our consideration and work in this area the foremost experts that we could to help us think through what might be the implications for the New Start. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce them, although I don't think they need much introduction at all. We have Rose Gottemoeller, currently Distinguished Lecturer at Stanford University. But formerly Deputy Secretary General of NATO, and prior to that, Under Secretary General for Arms Control and International Security at the US Department of State. What that little blurb doesn't say is that Rose was also the chief US negotiator of New Start, so someone who's involved and aware and expert on all aspects of it. We're delighted also from Russia to be joined by Evgeny Buzhinsky, chairman of the Peer Center in Moscow, and many of you know the center well and its excellent work on arms control, vice president of RIC, and formerly head of the International Treaties Department of the Ministry of Defense of Russia. So both Rose and Evgeny have been kind enough to agree to share their personal experiences. And so they'll be speaking in their personal capacity on where we are in New START today, but perhaps trying to look forward to some of the questions around how the future of nuclear arms control treaties will deal with the issues of compliance and enforcement. Now, we only have an hour today, so to make the most of this and to give you a chance to pose your questions to our speakers, I'm going to move quite quickly to maybe kick the ball off with a few questions to both Rose and Evgeny, and then we're going to really open the floor to participants' questions. We're not going to open the microphones to you just because of technology gremlins and time gaps. So what we'll do instead is ask you to submit your questions in writing. And you can do that via the little Q&A button. If you toggle your screen, you'll see the Q&A function, and it's in the bar at the bottom of the Zoom window. You just click on that and put in your question. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible, and if we do get many, we'll try to group them along themes. So if we don't exactly use your wording, please forgive us to that. I should note that other participants will not be able to see your question, so don't feel that you're broadcasting live, but you can submit questions at any point in the discussion. And finally, just before we move off, I will note, of course, that this discussion is being recorded, so just so that you are all aware. But maybe now we'll get started, Rose, and Evgeny, if I can ask you, maybe just to get us moving and looking at this question as what feasible new steps are required for the successful extension of New START in February or by February 2021. Rose, perhaps I can kick off with you and your thoughts on that.
Thank you very much, Renata, and let me say what a pleasure it is to be appearing with you and Evgeny Buzhinsky, a longtime colleague in Moscow and a very respected expert on these matters. I also wanted to say how much I have liked your compliance series that you've been doing. You put up a number of the titles on the screen, so I just also wanted to endorse them to your listeners today, that I think it's a really good set of reports on the compliance set of issues. So thank you for UNIDIR doing that work. Now, you know, to the question of what are the feasible steps to take to extend New START, from a technical perspective, they are really quite simple because the treaty was written very, very simply. It is an inherent part of the treaty that New START can be extended for 5 years. And if a new treaty comes along during those 5 years, that the treaty can be superseded at that time. So I think that's an important point people don't often think about. They say, oh, 5 years extension and that's it. But as a matter of fact, it is possible to negotiate a new treaty in that period, and then New START would be superseded at that time. But the steps foreseen in the treaty itself are rather simple. It could be done by an exchange of diplomatic notes and not a complicated matter at all. Now, the political questions are another question. As your listeners would recognize, this administration in Washington, the Trump administration, has been hesitant about the treaty in many ways. The president himself expressed skepticism during his first conversation with President Putin way back in 2017 when he first came into office. And so the new they're not new anymore, but the current administration has been rather hesitant about the treaty. I do understand now, in the context of the discussions between the Special Envoy Marshall Billingsley and Sergei Rybkov in Vienna, that the US side is talking now about an extension of the New START treaty in order to continue to have time to negotiate a new treaty with Moscow. But there are issues on the US side in the political realm, and there can be no questions about that. But from a technical matter, from the perspective of the technical questions, it is a simple matter to extend the treaty.
Thanks very much, Rose, and thanks for walking us through so clearly the procedure for extending. Evgeny, to you, any thoughts from your side on the factors and relating to extension?
Thank you very much, Renata. I'm also very pleased and honored to speak to such an audience, and I'm very glad to meet Rose, whom I I've known for almost 20 years. She was chief negotiator on START, US negotiator, and I was deputy head of Russian chief negotiator at the initial part of the process. About the extension, I fully agree that technically it's very simple. It's not that simple on the Russian side because according to our internal legislation, we need at least months, maybe two, to because extension needs a sort of ratification, a sort of going through procedures in our parliament. But still, yes, it's the main obstacle is a political one. I remember that President Trump, when he characterized START as a bad treaty. I understand that, maybe it was bad in his opinion because it did not contain special ceilings, sub-ceilings for Russian heavy mirrored missiles. Maybe that was the, for me, actually, New START is the first fair treaty in Soviet-American, Russian-American relations on nuclear issues, because all predecessors of this START, of the New START, contained special sub-ceilings for Russian missiles, heavy missiles, mirrored missiles. So I hope that maybe some way out will be found by Marshal Billingsley and Sergei Rybkov. But to be frank, I'm pessimistic. I'm pessimistic because the preconditions put forward by the US delegation is that in Vienna, to say nothing about preconditions put forward by President Trump before, that is China, all nuclear armaments and verification procedure should be more severe. I don't think it's possible to meet all those conditions in such a short period of time before the treaty expires.
Thanks, Evgeny. And you both, I think, show your alliance and allegiance to New START in pointing it out, whether an equal treaty, a fair treaty, a simple treaty, a treaty that can be easily extended or not. But I think if we could, and you both, I think, point to the political constraints being so central to its extension. But before we just move on to the political constraints, maybe I could keep you on the technical aspects for a little bit longer. Are there components of past bilateral treaties, INF or New START, that could have been better developed? You described Evgeny as the New START as the first or the most equal treaty. But are there things that you think could have been better developed in this treaty? And I'll start with you first before moving on to Rose.
Thank you, Renata. I don't think we should start talking about INF because INF has gone, and of course, if in 1987 Soviet negotiators could foresee, or American negotiations could foresee the difficulties which will actually become an obstacle to the implementation of the treaty. Of course, that would be much easier, but in 1987, there were no strike drones, for example, and there was no Aegis ashore. So about START, you see, when we started the process, we agreed with the United States delegation that this treaty should be cheaper, simpler, and more, I repeat, more fair. And we achieved that. You see why cheaper and simpler. One example, in START 1, there were 12 kinds of inspections. Of course, inspections is the most expensive part of implementation of the treaty. In the new treaty, our Rose and Anatoly Antonov managed to agree on only 2 kinds of inspections. One for deployed and one for non-deployed warheads and launchers. So the treaty, in my opinion, is very good. Everything was balanced and is still balanced. But now the US delegation insists that verification is too weak, is too loose. I don't know, my English does not allow me to find another words. That's why I don't, of course, it's possible to come back to START 1 verification regime, but I don't think that that will be the best way out.
Thanks, Evgeny, and that really links very nicely to you, Rose. In retrospect, or from where you stand now, do you think there are some themes that could have been strengthened or better developed?
I am going to disagree with my esteemed colleague Evgeny in that I do not believe that it's possible to return to the START verification regime. And I wanted to start my remarks by emphasizing for your listeners that the obligations of a particular treaty determine what is necessary for monitoring and verification. The START treaty used so-called counting rules for determining the number of delivery vehicles or warheads on the top of each missile. And so a missile like the SS-18, the Soviet, now Russian heavy missile, was always counted as having 10 warheads, even though it is a heavy enough lift vehicle that it could have 14, 15, 16, I don't know how many, but more than 10. In any event, we decided to try to gain more precision in the new START treaty by actually confirming the number of objects on the front of each missile during the inspection process and disposing of that older counting rule. And so that is what we achieved in New START. I happen to believe, and I think the US government in general agrees, that this has given us a more precise accounting of the Russian warheads on the missiles. And of course, it's all reciprocal. So the Russians have the same, more precise accounting of the warheads on the US missiles. So you see, the obligations of New START and START were different. And that's why I don't think it's possible to return to the START verification regime. And one last point on this, it's interesting because I know that the US negotiators in Vienna have been very insistent on returning to some more extensive telemetry exchanges. Now, telemetry exchanges, they are the exchange of data that is a missile will generate during its test flights. And that's called telemetry. That's a very simplified way of describing it, but in any event, it gives you a feeling. And that telemetry helps to determine that older counting rule. So the largest number of delivery vehicles with which a missile is tested, that is then determined to be the counting rule for that missile. So the SS-18 was tested with 10 delivery vehicles, and so it was always counted with 10 delivery vehicles, even though it's had more capacity to lift warheads. So long story short, it's no longer needed in New START, but the current administration wants to gain more telemetry exchanges back again. I note in their proposal, they seem to have proposed simply to go to the maximum number of test flight exchanges that were allowed in New START, up to 5, rather than saying, okay, we have to go back to that earlier approach because now we're going to be looking to confirm a counting rule. This is a little bit complicated for listeners, I know, but long story short, even with the current administration's proposal, they're not talking about harking back to the approach that was taken in START, but to really filling out what was allowed under New START in terms of telemetry exchanges.
Yeah,
Renata, may I just add, because
you can briefly.
I don't want to be misunderstood. When I said to come back to START 1, I meant the new treaty. Of course, it's impossible to introduce the verification of start one to the new start. Of course, that's impossible. I was talking about the actually proposal of Trump administration to immediately start negotiations on the new treaty.
No, thanks for that clarification, Evgeny. And I think you both, in a way, have highlighted some of the core issues around confidence in arms control agreement, which is the question of precision of information, the question of how you delimit the scale of information exchange, the regularity, and on what, and what's that scope. And so I think these are very much, I think, at the core of some of the discussions today. Maybe, Rose, I'll start with you next on this one. Where we are now, in terms of arms control and the sense of not just the erosion of arms control agreements, but the erosion of confidence in the potential of arms control agreements to maintain stability and to provide for security. What do you think states now need to do to build confidence and compliance in arms control going forward? I know I'm throwing you a large question.
Well, it all does come down to mutual confidence and trust, and you gain mutual confidence and trust through the process of reliable implementation of a treaty. In the case of New START, I think both Washington and Moscow have repeatedly confirmed that the treaty is being implemented according to its terms, and that there is no consideration on either side that there is a violation of the New START treaty. Now, I know Russia has some compliance concerns with the United States. I'll let Evgeny speak to those if he wishes to. Those are the kinds of concerns that can be resolved in the course of treaty implementation by taking them to, in the case of New START, the Bilateral Consultative Commission, the BCC. These are normal implementation bodies. Every treaty has them. If there are questions, the sides come to the table and discuss how to resolve them. So I think New START is actually a very good example of a treaty that, that has been reliably implemented. The trouble comes about when one side or another begins to fall away from the obligations of the treaty, fall away from the monitoring regime. I think, frankly, one of the issues with INF is that once the ban on intermediate range nuclear forces that are ground launched was completely implemented, the INF monitoring and verification regime shut down. And to my mind, that is one of the reasons why over time, and I'm sure Evgeny will disagree with me on this, but over time, Russia began to violate the INF treaty with a new group of ground launched cruise missiles that are intermediate range. Long story short, I think mutual trust, mutual confidence, and then a clean slate of implementation over time that continues to bolster that mutual trust and confidence so that both sides are able to say with a clear voice and at official levels that the treaty is being properly implemented. It's simple, but those are the core aspects.
And it really speaks to some of the institutional aspects of treaty implementation, the need for that sort of structured exchange and dialogue. Evgeny, your thoughts on where we need to move forward? And I'm going to invite the audience to start putting in questions now to chat function.
Well, first of all, I just for the record, I don't agree that Russia violated the INF treaty. United States were the first to violate the INF treaty. With deployment of Aegis ashore, because nobody in Russia could understand why Mk-41 launcher on board a warship could launch cruise missiles and being ashore couldn't. It's very difficult to understand. But about START, I agree with Rose that both Washington and Moscow are implementing START quite successfully. Of course, Russia has some concerns about the US interpretation of some provisions of the treaty. The most obvious example is conversion, when United States just converted 4 launchers on each of their 14 submarines, just replacing the flexible membrane by the iron cover with some 8 screws and saying, not counted. When our inspector said, okay, why only cover with screws, at least get rid of the something more important in that launch, the United States said no. Or just saying that these Minutemen, I don't remember, 4 or Minutemen said just meant for training, not counted. So all in all, 104 US launchers, they believe, are not counted as being the against the counting levels of start. So but these are technical issues, and of course they could be solved through the consultative commission.
Okay, well, I'm going to, if I can, Evgeny, beg your indulgence, because I have one final question, and I see there's quite a few questions coming in from the audience. So perhaps I can maybe just ask you both one final question. Very much the discussions around the New START extension have centered on the question of whether a bilateral treaty should be extended to be a trilateral framework. So maybe just any thoughts from either of you as to whether you see futures for bilateral treaties, or whether we'll be looking at plurilateral, whether trilateral or even a bigger group of states as we go forward. Rose, do you want to take a go at that? And then I'll give you the last word, Evgeny.
Well, I'm very pleased actually that the Trump administration has dropped their insistence that China be somehow shoehorned into the New START treaty, because it doesn't make any sense. China has a much smaller nuclear arsenal than the United States and the Russian Federation. We and the Russians each have deployed 1,550 warheads and several thousand additional warheads that are not held in deployed status, that is already loaded on top of their missiles or other delivery vehicles. But the Chinese have, well, the latest Department of Defense report that just came out 2 weeks ago said they have about 250 warheads, under 300 warheads. So, you know, you can see the huge differential in the size of the two arsenals. So I was glad that that condition was dropped. However, the administration did put through very clearly the message that they want to see China included in a future strategic arms reduction treaty. To be honest with you, I see as more logical to try to bring China to the table to discuss intermediate range forces, ground-launched forces, because these are widely deployed, including in the Chinese armed forces, and they do pose a rapid time-to-target threat, and that can mean that they can threaten critical command and control targets with very little warning or no warning at all. And I think that frankly, there could be a Chinese interest in joining such negotiations, because they see the possibility of the US deploying ground-launched cruise missiles in Asia, and they also are watching the deployment of Russian very highly capable ground-launched missiles in Asia as well. And so I think that they could have an interest in trying to constrain such missiles. One final point on this is, I think thanks to the methodology we've developed in New START for actually confirming the number of warheads on the tops of missiles, the number of reentry vehicles on the tops of missiles, that we actually have the potential now to determine, you know, a limit on ground-launched missiles, and leave the Chinese have some conventionally armed ones and limit the number of nuclear ones. If you're interested in reading more about this, you'll see in the chat line I published an article in the Washington Quarterly this week. And for a more extensive discussion of why I believe this is a feasible negotiation, I refer you to that article.
Thank you, Rose. And we've also put the link to your article on the general chat for everybody. Evgeny, your thoughts on the future of bilateral or plurilateral or trilateral agreements.
Well, first of all, I think that even if a new treaty will become possible in the future, I don't think it would be. It will be trilateral. It will be bilateral because normally arms control negotiations, especially nuclear arms control negotiations, are negotiations between equals. Oh, sorry. Do you hear me? Yeah. So negotiations between equals. China is not equal to, as Rose mentioned, to United States and Russia. Although, frankly, I do not believe in this magic figure 250 or 300 they have been publishing for the last 20 years. I think they have more, but they're not transparent and they do not want to be transparent. They don't, maybe for some political reasons. Second, you see, these nuclear forces are not just forces for unobvious reasons. They're meant for deterrence. And I don't believe there is no such thing as multilateral deterrence. Each country has their own subject or object of deterrence. So to involve China, Russia is not a subject for deterrence for China. Maybe, and the United States is not object of deterrence. To involve China not involving India, impossible. To involve India not involving Pakistan, also impossible, and so on and so forth. Third, due to the inequality of nuclear arsenals, it's extremely difficult to imagine the verification, system of verification. I remember 15 years ago, I had a conversation with my vis-a-vis in the UK Minister of Defense. He said, we discussed this because he expressed some ideas that UK may also join the negotiations of these procedures. And I said, what about verification? What are you going to show me? Your 3 submarines. Okay, I'll see your 3 submarines. What should I show to you? My 3 submarines or something else? He said, no, I want to see everything. Air, ground, and naval. And that's, of course, the conversation was over. So I repeat, I don't think that in foreseeable future, China may be involved in strategic talks on the strategic nuclear weapons. Yes, intermediate range, I agree with Rose, China may be more interested, but not in big ones.
Okay, thank you both for being so precise, so focused. There's lots of questions coming in, some general to both of you and some specifically coming in to one or the other of you. So I'll group a few of those together and I will start off. We have got at least 2 questions around issues of verification, which you both have emphasized in talking about also the future of arms control agreements going forward. As really one, you start as one of the few explicit provisions on non-interference with national technical means of verification, that it was very explicit on that. Are there any other such provisions? And the reason that this question is coming up is, will the expiration leave open the possibility of interference with assets like satellites? So a question to both of you. Rose, do you want to take that first?
Certainly, and that's a very good question. You know, it's very interesting that non-interference with national technical means that both the Russian side and the US side have agreed that we will not impede the operations of our overhead satellites, reconnaissance satellites, or over-the-horizon radars, certain types of airborne reconnaissance, in order to be able to implement the treaty. Now, this is a long-standing part of strategic arms control treaties with roots back in the 1970s. It was frankly one of the easiest articles to negotiate in the New START treaty, because I think both sides well recognize now that the more you have non-interference with national technical means, the less you have to worry about on-site inspections being called. If actually we can see that a country is complying through national technical means, then that means that fewer inspections are required. I frankly think that is an important step for the future, to think about how to boost and bolster national technical means so as to control the number of on-site inspections going forward. But the specific question is if there are other regimes that have this, and as a matter of fact, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty does have a provision for non-interference with national technical means, which pulls in the Chinese as well. And so they are familiar with this particular provision, and I think this is good. Now, of course, CTBT has not entered into force. According to the Vienna Law of Treaties, it should be respected, nevertheless, by the signatories of the treaty. So, but I just wanted to make the point for your listeners that there is at least one other very large multilateral treaty that does have non-interference with national technical means as part of it.
Thank you, Rose, and we rely on your extensive and incredible knowledge to help us through in that. I should have flagged that question came from our former colleague, Daniel Porras, now with the Secure World Foundation. Maybe just building on, Rose, one more question that came directly to you, and then I will have a few questions to you, Evgeny. And a question from one of our Chinese colleagues here. The question of how to expand the scope of future arms control agreements, and especially in the context of new technologies, how would you envisage the future verification regime to cover more weapons, including more missiles, ASATs, and even space-based weapons?
Well, I refer you again to my Washington Quarterly article where I talk about this, and I really endorse a step-by-step approach. We cannot bite it all off at once. And that is why I think, frankly, the proposal of the Trump administration in the next treaty, to try to constrain all warheads, to place a limit on all warheads, including non-strategic warheads and non-deployed warheads, is the right direction. That's a very difficult problem. It's a long-standing problem in strategic arms control. Shall we go after warheads directly, or what shall we continue to constrain warheads by their association with their delivery vehicles? In other words, if an ICBM had 10 warheads on it, once the ICBM was taken out of operational deployment and eliminated under the treaty, those warheads went back to storage. They were non-deployed, and we considered that they were no longer in the counting scheme, but they continued to exist. So now the thought is to try to begin to control warheads directly. I think that's the right step. It's going to be a big verification and monitoring problem to confront, and I know there's a lot of work going on that already, including at UNIDIR, but the IPNDV, the UK-Norway project, there are a number of areas, and that has gone on to other work involving Sweden and other countries as well. So I think we need to continue to do a lot of work both in and out of government to confront the technical challenges of monitoring and verifying reductions and elimination of warheads. But to me, that's a critical first step. And then we need to start thinking now, but take it on a step-by-step basis. Otherwise, we won't be able to handle it all. And to be honest with you, some of these technologies, people talk about cyber technology, and if we can somehow monitor, cyber software and that type of thing, some of these, I think, we will not be able to get our arms around from a traditional perspective in terms of monitoring and verification, but I do welcome efforts and thought that goes into trying to get a handle on those issues as well.
Thanks, Rose. Evgeny, one question that we have here is whether you foresee any possible resistance in the Duma toward ratifying the New START extension. You pointed out that this was a requirement in the Russian procedure for verification, but would you see that as a challenge?
No, thank you for the question. No, I don't think any difficulties in Russian Duma if the extension, if US administration agrees to the extension of the existing treaty. Even, you see, Russia even agreed to include, for example, avant-garde and Sarmat, into the against the ceiling of the treaty. Although it's not very natural for any treaty, because avant-garde and especially Sarmat is not operational. To include non-operational kinds of weapons into the counting rule of the treaty is not natural. But even to this unnatural procedure, Russian government agreed. So if United States agrees to extend START in its present form, I think there will be no difficulty. And President Putin already confirmed that twice.
Thanks, Evgeny. And while you have the floor, maybe just a question. You both mentioned consultative bodies as part of treaties to support implementation. And that mechanism existed in the INF, but ironically, it wasn't used to resolve the disputes that arose. Russia didn't try to convene the BCC, as we understand it, to raise its concerns about the HERA and the UAVs back in the 1990s. And when the US raised concerns about the 9M729, it was outside the BCC. So is that a question, because you're both talking about, you both flagged the importance of having these bodies and these mechanisms that allow for consultation and dialogue, but are they being used by the two parties? Evgeny, do you want to take a go at that?
Oh, well, you see, as for the, again, you want to discuss INF treaty, Russia offered the last effort to save the treaty. Russia offered the full inspection of the of that missile in question, but the United States and its allies refused even to be present at the demonstration. So it was mainly, I am sure, the political decision not to. Well, you see, the United States actually, the position of the US government was extremely unacceptable, because they said, get rid, destroy all these missiles. You see, to destroy an operational missile, first of all, it's because it's not in violation of the provisions of the treaty. It was tested for less than 500 kilometers. And the United States did not provide any proofs that it was tested at a larger distance. And Minister of Defense of Russian Federation was eager to demonstrate, even to take the US inspectors to some missile range to demonstrate the launch and all the rest, but unfortunately, the United States refused. So all issues may be solved through the consultative commissions if there is a political will. If there is no political will, of course, nothing can be done.
Yeah, I think that's two questions in one there, political will and consultative bodies. But Rose, do you want to answer that question, or you're comfortable to move on?
Yes. Well, first I'll just make a quick comment. You know, obviously demonstrations can be very, very useful, but it's important to remember that demonstrations are not like inspections. In inspections, the two sides negotiate very carefully the procedures, and it's understood what each side will see during the inspection, and it's understood what, again, what kind of obligation is being monitored. In the case of a demonstration, like a single flight demonstration out at the Russian Flight Test Center, to my mind, that doesn't prove anything, because missiles can be tested to various ranges. You add a little more fuel, a little less fuel, you put a heavier payload, a lighter payload on it, it doesn't prove anything. it may have been useful to do that demonstration, and I'm not commenting on the decision of the USG not to attend the demonstration. I wasn't in government then. I was at NATO, so I don't know exactly what the thinking was, but I will say, and I do want to underscore that demonstrations are useful, but they have a limited utility, I think, in my view, because the procedures are not carefully agreed in advance. And you know, the question I saw, it was a very good one from Pavel Pudvig. Why didn't we use that the Consultative Commission for INF in the case of the INF non-compliance that we were concerned about? That was because we felt it was so important to try to save the treaty that we immediately took it to a higher political level. The implementation bodies are very good people. They are excellent. They're top-notch experts. They know their technical side very, very well, but it's not at the political level. So the fact that I was the first one to demarche the Russian side as the Undersecretary of State, that was a specific decision of the USG that we immediately wanted to flag for Moscow, how important we thought this issue was, but also our sincere wish to try to resolve the compliance concern, to work with the Russian Federation to resolve the compliance concern. And this was my message throughout the years that I tried to work this with Russia. But during my time as Undersecretary, the Russian Federation chose not to acknowledge the existence of the missile. So it was not an easy errand.
Thanks, Rose, and obviously some very interesting questions about when and how to use and to work through institutions, and when and how to work through political channels. We have two interesting questions and somewhat related coming through from our German colleagues, Thoralf Pils here in Geneva from the German mission, and Oliver Meyer in Hamburg. So I'm going to sort of weave them together a little bit, but maybe the first to you both. How do you assess the feasibility of not just a new agreement, a new START extension with more participants, but a broader agreement covering strategic and non-strategic warheads, or active and retired warheads, or defensive systems like missile defenses? Oliver has a sort of a particular angle on that. It says this idea of a framework approach that includes all stretches of types of weapon. Is this feasible? And if so, how? Evgeny, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, thanks. First of all, about strategic and non-strategic. Rose said that that could be a step in the right direction. I agree, although for Russia, non-strategic nuclear weapons, they play not the same role as they play for the United States. For the United States, actually, United States, the main task for any armed forces is to defend its national territory. United States does not need non-strategic nuclear weapons to defend its national territory. They need it only to be used in some distant theaters in Europe, in the Middle East, in Asia, somewhere, not in the continent of the United States. For Russia, it's a regional means of deterrence, because we, on our borders, we have many states which possess nuclear weapons or may possess in the future nuclear weapons. But still, I think it's possible. But of course, a huge problem of verification of strategic and non-strategic, especially for Russia, because all our non-strategic nuclear warheads are kept in the so-called centralized storage sites together with strategic. So the issue is being discussed, I know, but I think there are a lot of technical problems. As for well, the limits on other negotiation arms control in other areas. That's what actually puzzles a lot of Russian experts and government people when I was in the Ministry of Defense. United States simply does not want to discuss some issues. For example, missile defense. It's concern of ours, because missile defense was one of the pillars of the so-called strategic stability. United States said, no, it's a sacred cow. It's a bipartisan, consensus that missile defense is not discussable. Why? Or space, for example. We said, okay, if you want to discuss non-strategic nuclear weapons, let's discuss the arms control issues and conflicts. We have our own concerns, you have your concerns. But the United States said, no, missile defense is out, space is out, let's discuss your non-strategic nuclear weapons. It's not fair.
And with that, Rose, the floor is yours.
Well, Evgeny is quite right. There is a strong consensus in the United States not to limit our limited national missile defenses, which are designed to defend against a North Korean threat at the moment, and possibly in future an Iranian threat. But at the moment, the focus is on North Korea. And so that's why, and we and our colleagues in Moscow have argued about this in government and out for 20 years or more. But we continue to believe that the limited nature of US national missile defenses should not give Russia pause, because they do not actually undermine strategic stability. And we made a statement to that effect at the time that the New START treaty was an official statement at the highest level at the time New START was completed and signed. So the president made that statement. But the really interesting thing is, I think we're going to have to think in a multifaceted way. I talked about my conviction that step by step is going to be really important. And there are a lot of people in the United States now thinking about a multifaceted approach where we could try to figure out ways to respond to some of the Russian concerns about missile defense, maybe not by shoehorning everything into a single treaty, but by having some additional types of documents, some political commitments, some confidence building measures, some different kinds of joint activities that would raise Russian confidence and eventually, I suppose, Chinese confidence in the nature of US missile defenses. And as I said, I do not include that in my recent Washington Quarterly article, but there's a really good article by James Timby in Daedalus from last summer, just in June or so it came out. And he talks about this kind of multifaceted approach where we think about treaties, yes, but we also think about other kinds of building blocks for the development of further mutual confidence and predictability. So I endorse those ideas, and there are people here in the US who are thinking a lot about how to do that. And another thing I'll say is I've really appreciated being able with Evgeny and both US and Russian colleagues to participate in discussions of this kind under the National Academy of Sciences and Russian Academy of Sciences dialogue that we've had going on. And frankly, Zoom has really helped that, because we've been able to have some regularized discussions, and I think it's a very healthy thing.
Yeah, I think both of you highlight something that is becoming one of the major questions, and I think it's in some of the questions that has come in from the audiences. What does the future of arms control look like in this more enmeshed, multiple tools and multiple frameworks, and how we work that, how we approach that, how they speak to each other, how we avoid duplication and overlap, but how they become mutually reinforcing as opposed to mutually damaging. We have very much a question at the heart of this discussion from our colleague in New York, Amir Nasser, from the mission of Malaysia to the UN, which is really, I think, the big 64-ton gorilla in the room, which is, what happens to arms control if New START is not extended? And specifically, what do you both assess as the ramifications for international peace and security over the next few years? Evgeny, do you have thoughts on that question?
Well, yes. You see, first of all, about the so-called strategic stability. There used to be 3 pillars of the strategic stability. That is ABM Treaty, INF Treaty and START. The first two have now gone. The last one is in question. So if START is not extended and there will be no START, of course, there will be no strategic stability. There will be no predictability because you see, and of course, there will be limited, but of course, sort of arms race. Because first of all, I'm sure that United States will upload their Tridents, their Minutemens, so the limit will be, of course, it won't be 1550, it will be more. Second, and the lack of predictability, the lack of openness, because with national technical means you cannot compensate. You cannot see from space how many warheads are on the platform of Trident or Sarmat or Yars. So it will be just the period of uncertainty in strategic relations between at least the United States and Russia. But I'm sure that sooner or later arms control will come back. I mean, especially nuclear arms control. If you remember the history, what was the actually the first impulse for the limitation of strategic nuclear forces? Because in the end of the 60s, both Soviet Union and United States had 30,000 warheads each. But after Cuban Missile Crisis, they decided that that was too much. I don't want to say that we'll have another sort of missile crisis before we start next round of arms control negotiations, but I'm sure sooner or later arms control will be back.
Thanks, Evgeny. And not to waste a good crisis, Rose, final thoughts from you on the question of what's next?
I think we need to look at a couple different scenarios if New START goes away in February. Frankly, I don't think we'll fall off a cliff because the habits of strategic arms control are well established now, and we and the Russian Federation have been engaging in this matter for over 50 years at this point. So I don't think that suddenly we're going to go from 1550 warheads up to, you know, back up to the levels of START, which was 6,000 warheads deployed on each side, because numbers have come down overall. But I do think Evgeny's right that both sides could upload, and that is put more warheads on top of their missiles and break out of that 1550 limit rather quickly. And in the case of the United States, watching what Russia might do with its very capable missile force, we believe that they could deploy up to 1,000 additional warheads above 1550 in fairly short time period. I think, frankly, that in that context, the lack of, again, predictability and stability and mutual confidence at a time when the United States is trying to modernize our nuclear arsenal, our nuclear triad, I think that that will drive Washington to want to engage again in strategic nuclear arms control, because the Russian Federation has pretty well completed their strategic triad modernization. They've done a lot and have very capable now mobile missiles going into the field. They have hot production lines for their missiles as well as for warheads. The US is in a situation where we are just now embarking on our nuclear triad modernization. And I think we need the stability and predictability to know that we can implement that modernization within certain limits. And within certain limits means you have to have an arms control treaty in place. I believe the easiest way to do that is to extend New START to get that predictability for our period of modernization. But if that doesn't happen, then I think the logic of having a modernization where we're not constantly chasing Russian numbers of either missiles or warheads, I think that will bring us back to the table. Evgeny's concerned about US upload, so I think it will bring the Russian Federation back to the table as well.
Thank you both. Thank you both so much. I think what is interesting is that we're ending up in a relatively, I don't want to say optimistic place, but to hear two such experienced arms control experts as yourselves end with a point that reinforces the importance and the logic of arms control, notwithstanding its modern challenges and current challenges that we find ourselves, not just from the context of bilateral relations between Russia and the US, but the wider new technologies, emerging technologies and challenges, I think is a really important element on which we can build. I am very conscious that it's 6 p.m. and we've promised to keep you only an hour. So I'm going to stop here with my apologies to all those whose questions we didn't get to. Can I just say thank you so much for the really excellent and thoughtful questions. Could I thank very much Rose and Evgeny for taking the time with us and for being so thoughtful about new as well as older questions, and for being game to also address questions related to INF even as we went along, and not just limit your answers to consideration of New Start. Thanks to the UNIDIR team for producing this event, Letitia, Wilfred, John and Jamie, many, many thanks. Many thanks to the Norwegian government support that enables this work on compliance and enforcement, which really I think is so increasingly critical today. And to you, the audience, as always, we're very grateful for you joining. Please fill in our feedback form if you can. We try to be as responsive as we can to your thoughts, your perspectives and your feedback, and we always love to get it. So do please keep us on your minds. As we go forward with this work on compliance and enforcement, we'll have a series of publications coming through in the next couple of months, and we very much encourage you to check in on our website, join our events, and continue the conversation, which really at its heart is a question about the future of arms control at a time when it's needed more than ever. Rose, Evgeny, and everyone else, I leave you and all the best wishes to keep for a safe and good evening and weekends ahead. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you. Goodbye.